Good afternoon and welcome everyone to the third in a series of webinars TEQSA has been offering in the quality assurance area. I'm Joan Cooper, one of the commissioners, and I'm also the chair of TEQSA's Expert Advisory Board. I would like to begin today's session with acknowledgement to country. TEQSA acknowledges the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and their continuing connection to land, waters and community. We pay our respects to their cultures, country and elders, past, present and emerging. Now, before I begin the formal proceedings, I'd also like to do a little bit of housekeeping. First of all, please note that a video recording will be taken throughout this TEQSA event. These recordings may be used by TEQSA for marketing and publicity in our publications, websites and on social media accounts. For information about TEQSA's privacy policy, please visit teqsa.gov.au/privacy. I would also like to mention that today's session will provide an opportunity for members of the audience to ask questions. The best way to post a question is to use the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen, and you can do this throughout the session. You can also like other people's questions so we can respond to our audience most pressing questions at the end of this session. Today we are discussing the role of external experts within TEQSA's assessment process. With the quality of Australian higher education more important than ever, TEQSA's work to protect students' interest and the reputation of the sector is critical to ensuring that the sector continues to have quality assurance that supports diversity, innovation and excellence. The role of external experts is an important one, and as many of you will be aware, TEQSA uses external experts to provide independent advice on specific elements of our regulatory assessments that are undertaken by our assessment teams. The Register of External Experts is overseen by the Experts Advisory Board, which I mentioned I'm the chair of, and this group provides advice concerning the management of TEQSA's external experts workforce. Many of our audience members today are listed on TEQSA's Register of External Experts, and we have a diverse range of expertise across a broad range of educational discipline areas. While a number of our experts have undertaken an assignment for TEQSA in the past, there are a number of experts who have not yet, and we felt it important to host this webinar to provide an overview of the role of external experts. Our presenters today are Tristan Krautz, who is an Acting Assistant Director in TEQSA's Assurance Group. Tristan has responsibility for managing course accreditation and renewal of course accreditation applications from existing providers. Our second presenter is Professor Stephen Naylor, who is Chair of the Academic Board of James Cook University and is also a fellow member of TEQSA's Experts Advisory Board. Stephen himself has undertaken a number of expert assignments over the years and will be providing some insights into how he approaches an assignment. Thank you.
Thanks, Joan. Hi, everyone. I'm Justine Baranowskis. I look after TEQSA's external experts with my colleague, Fran. I'll be looking after the Q&A today, so please post your questions throughout the session and we'll look to answer these at the end when we do host Q&A. As Joan mentioned, we have two great presenters today, so I'll hand over to Tristan, who will talk us through an overview of assessments. Thanks, Tristan.
Thanks very much, Justine, and welcome again to everyone to TEQSA's webinar on the role of experts. As Joan said, my name is Tristan Krautz and I'm the Acting Assistant Director in the Assurance Group. My team specifically looks after course accreditations and renewal of course accreditation applications. We are probably the biggest users of expert reports in TEQSA, so it's apt and appropriate that I'm here today to talk with you. And also thank you very much for all the critical work that you do. Your expert reports enable us to ensure that our assessments are informed by current expertise in the sector and we're able to do our assessments as quickly as possible with the help of experts. I would like to start with an overview of our assessment process and our approach to assessment. And I think that will enable you to place your role as an expert in terms of the work we do and how that contributes to our regulatory activities and the decisions that we make as a regulator. Next slide, please, Tom. So here we have a high-level model of our approach to assessments. This is at the provider level, it's not at the sector level, so we're talking about assessments of providers. In order for us to do our assessments, we construct what we call a risk profile, or an understanding of the provider's capacity to comply with the threshold standards, as well as, if it's relevant, the national code. To build this risk profile, to build this understanding, we collect a range of information. We collect a range of inputs, and you'll see those on the left-hand side. So they include the delivery history of the provider. This is frequently obtained through the assessments we do over time, the compliance history of the provider, as well as the risk indicators that we track through our risk assessment framework. So each year TEQSA does an annual risk assessment based on those three inputs, and together with the compliance history and the higher education delivery history, we're able to form a picture and understanding of that provider's capacity to comply with the standards. Now, we use this risk profile to inform the assessments that we undertake. We use it to determine the standards that we will consider in an assessment, but we also use it to determine the types of evidence that a provider needs to submit and the types of evidence that we will need to collect to assess those standards. So we use it to inform the scope and evidence requirements for our registrations and accreditation assessments. We also do ad hoc compliance assessments. These may be in response to media reports, material change notifications, or referrals from government departments. Occasionally they do entail experts, but most of our experts, most of you, will be engaged in assessments of registration and assessments of accreditations against the threshold standards. Our assessment work, our assessment activities inform our regulatory decisions. So I'm in an assessment team. We will make recommendations to a decision maker. They could be the Commission or they could be a delegated decision maker. Underneath or permeating throughout all of these activities are our three regulatory principles. They're necessity, proportionality, and risk. These are the three factors that we need to have regard to in all of the work that we do. Ultimately, what that means is that everything that TEQSA does needs to be risk-based. Next slide, please, Tom. So you'll recall earlier that I mentioned that we track risk indicators over time, and we use that to build up our risk assessment, and we use that to build up an overall risk profile of a provider. What you see here is an example of the summary table that we include in our annual risk assessment, and you'll see that there are 11 indicators that we track against each provider over time. We use those 11 indicators to construct two composite indicators at the top. So indicators 1 through to 9, we use those to provide an overall risk rating of a provider's risk to students. So we look at things like growth, student growth, attrition, progression, graduate outcomes, graduate satisfaction. We look at staffing and the sufficiency of staffing. We look at it at an individual indicator level, and then we roll that up into a composite overall risk rating for risk to students. In this case, we have a low risk provider. There's lots of green and it's consistently low over time. And that's the other important point when we're looking at the risk profile of the provider, is we look at risk over time. We look at the provider's capacity to meet and comply with the standards over time. We also look at the risk to financial position. This is something that many of our experts don't necessarily get involved with. Most of our experts are focused on student or academic or research related assessments and matters. Occasionally we will look at using a financial expert, but generally we have in-house expertise to assess a provider's financial capacity. Next slide, please, Tom. Okay, so here we have a high risk provider, or a risk profile of a high risk provider. And as you can see, there's a lot more red, there's a lot more orange, and there's far less green. And again, you can see it's over time. It's in terms of determining whether we are looking at a high risk provider, we need to look at those individual risk indicators and the composite indicators over time. If there was a sudden change in the risk profile of a provider, then we may look further into the reasons as to why that is. But generally, a high risk provider is a provider that has been rated as high across multiple indicators and in the composite indicators over time. Now, this is important for us because we use these risk profiles to determine the scope of the evidence, the scope of the standards, so the standards that we will include in an assessment, and the types of evidence that we need to collect to be able to assess each of those standards. So for a high risk provider, we're likely to look at a broader range of standards and require a significantly increased volume of evidence across those standards. So in this case, you'll see that in indicators 2 and 3, this provider has a high attrition and high progress rates. They have a risk rating of high for those 2 indicators, and it's consistently high. What this suggests to us as an assessment team is that we will need to look very closely at the student monitoring standards, as well as those standards that relate to personal and academic support services. So those standards would be included in our assessment, and we would need to collect evidence against those standards. So we might look at the internal reports a provider uses. We might also consider the range of support services that are provided, as well as the adequacy of those support services. Do they have sufficient staff, and so on. So in essence, what we're doing is we're using the risk profile to indicate to us as an agency where we need to focus our assessment activities, what standards we need to consider, and what types of evidence we will need to collect, so that when we do bring that to you, we're actually bringing to you an assessment of the critical risk, what we consider as the critical risks to compliance in the context of this provider. Next slide, please, Tom. Okay, so that's our assessment model. We have our risk assessment framework, which builds up the risk profile of a provider, and we use that to determine the scope and evidence requirements for our assessment activities. What I'd like to do now is to actually step through the assessment process that we follow, and that will give you an idea in terms of where you will fit in as an expert into our assessments, and how your work, how your reports contribute to our assessment activities and the regulatory decisions that we make. Not all assessments will include all of these steps. These steps are for, I guess you could describe as our most complex, and those assessments where we have adverse outcomes or where we have identified concerns with the provider's capacity and ability to comply with the relevant standards. So the first step in our process, I think I've covered generally. It's the scoping. So we use the risk profile, identify the standards that we will be assessing, identify the types of evidence that a provider needs to submit, or the type of evidence that we need to collect. We have, for our more common assessments such as registrations and course accreditations, we have a core set of standards. So we've already identified the minimum standards that we consider in an assessment, and most low risk providers would be assessed under the core standards. And we do that because low risk providers generally have demonstrated a capacity to continuously comply with the standards. The higher risk provider that we saw earlier, we would consider standards beyond the core set of standards. We would actually extend the scope to include other standards and other evidence requirements. Once we've set the scope, we send that out to the provider and formally notify them that these are the standards we're looking at, and this is the evidence or the types of evidence that we would like you to submit. The provider then applies. They apply to renew or register under the TEQSA Act, or they apply to renew the accreditation of a course or to accredit a new course. We conduct a completeness check to make sure that all the information is there, that we have a sufficient and complete application, and we'll follow up with the provider if needed. We then move into the third step, which is our assessment planning stage. And this is where we decide if we are going to engage you. This is where we decide, do we need an expert or experts? What sort of experts do we need? I look after courses, so commonly we need discipline experts. But in re-registrations, they would be looking for governance experts, academic integrity experts. They may need experts in relation to student wellbeing and support services. And occasionally we get experts in specific disciplines that are offered by a provider. If we do need an expert, we go out to our panel of experts and we identify those who are suitably qualified. Once we've decided we need an expert, we then move into the assessment stage. So we've signed off on the assessment plan. Yes, we need an expert. The other decision we might make is, do we need a site visit? And again, experts may or may not be involved in the site visit. Typically, we would involve at least one expert if we've got a panel of experts on a site visit. So after the assessment plan's been signed off and it's agreed by everyone within TEQSA, we would then engage people like you. And what we do is once we have engaged you, so we identify a pool of experts, we would notify the provider that we are seeking to engage one or more of these experts, and they would confirm that there's no conflict. We would then come to you with a contract and say, well, are you willing and able? And if you say yes, then we sign you up and we commence the assessment with you. What we do, and Stephen's going to talk more about it, but in essence, what we do is we will send you an expert brief, which has the standards and the evidence that we would like you to assess. You then go and do your assessment, and I'll leave it to Stephen to talk about that process. What I would like to get to, though, is the step after you have completed your report and you've sent your report into someone like me and my team. We would receive your report, so you've written up your findings, you've written up your analysis. We would receive that report, and the first thing we do is we would check the report for internal consistency. So the thing that I look for is, does the analysis match the conclusions? And I know this sounds fairly straightforward and fairly basic or simple, but for the type of work that we need to do, we need to ensure that as far as possible and practical, that there is that consistency in the analysis and in the assessment, and that our decisions, subsequent decisions, are informed by robust analysis and robust findings. So we would check for that internal consistency. Does the analysis match the conclusions, or more correctly, are the conclusions consistent with your analysis? We also look at consistency across the standards. So the higher education standards are written in such a way that many of the standards intersect with each other. So course learning outcomes have a relationship with the alignment with the AQF. They have a relationship with assessments. They also have a relationship with the types of resources that a provider needs to make available to students. So we would look at your findings, for example, in the context of course learning outcomes, and then we would look at all of those related standards and requirements and ensure that they are, when taken together, they are consistent. So the key message there is internal consistency and consistency across the different related standards. When there are concerns, we would put those concerns to a provider through a summary of concerns, and then they respond to those summary of concerns. Next slide, please, Tom. After we've when we've identified concerns, we've put them to the provider, we give the provider an opportunity to respond. And what happens after that is simply rinse and repeat. So the provider will respond, will assess the response, and then if needed, we'll come back to you as an expert to review that response. So your involvement may not end after your first initial engagement. We may come back to you to review a provider's response to any concerns. The remaining steps in the process I'll discuss after Stephen has conducted his presentation, because that relates to decision-making outcomes, but it's largely following the same process that I identified earlier. Next slide, please, Tom. Finally, how TEQSA uses experts is slightly different to how experts are used more generally in higher education. Higher education expert reviews are often built on peer review. TEQSA uses experts more in terms of seeking expert opinion on specific matters. So it's not a peer reviewing another peer. You are making an expert judgment on specific standards and the evidence that's been submitted against those standards. And that's it for me. I'll now pass over to Stephen and he can tell you a bit more about the experience as an expert.
Thank you, Tristan. Welcome everybody. It's terrific to be on a webinar to share some experiences that I've had. Being one of the experts has been a great joy and given me incredible insights for more than a decade, I suppose. So I'm an expert, but I'm not an expert. I think we all learn as we go ahead. And every time I take on a new one of these roles, it throws up something new, which is terrific. So next slide, please. Now, look, as I said, I'm the chair of the academic board. So, you know, within a self-accrediting university, I guess I'm the final signatory, or our board is the final signatory of new courses. And it's nice to step into the tertiary education space that perhaps works on a slightly different model, but we can bring a lot of those experiences. It's always with trepidation. You open the email from TEQSA and here's your assignment, and it's a bit like Mission Impossible for those of you who are old enough to remember, where you get a task and that task then sort of disappears in a puff of smoke, and you're sort of left with this tantalising opportunity to take on something new. And basically it's always a polite letter from the engaging experts team, and you sort of say, oh gosh, you know, I think I could do something here for them, which is always interesting. So you then say, oh yes, I'm happy to do this. I don't have a conflict with this particular organisation, and it fits my my skill set. So look, I'm happy to take this on board. Now, it is important to know that you know, there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of experts that are on our register, and some of them are in particular disciplines that do not often have a number of courses or programs that need expert advice. For instance, you know, there's not much call for sort of, you know, brain surgeons in the private provider category. clearly. You know, there will be areas like in business, you know, the creative arts, the arts, you know, many of those areas, IT. So, you know, there'll be areas that probably come up more frequently. So if you haven't been engaged very often, it's not because they don't value you, it's the sort of needs that Tristan has identified that are required. Next slide, please. So what you'll do is you'll accept that you're prepared to undertake this, and you'll be sent a brief. And as Tristan said, his team work through the various risk levels that particular provider, which is a non-self-accrediting organisation, usually an RTO, usually for profit, although there are RTOs that, you know, are faith-based and a whole range of other RTOs as well. But they will have a profile of risk, and the team headed by Tristan will identify the particular standards that are required. And on that assignment brief, these will be identified to you, and you can sort of see on this particular slide here the areas that are to be investigated. Often it's not the full suite of standards, and that's a thankful situation sometimes, because there's an awful lot of standards that we need to meet. But because they do cluster around particular themes, you will actually find that one will lead to the other, and it will make a lot more sense as you go through. From what I've found, I don't know, I've done 15 or something like this over the years. Everyone's a little bit different. You just don't quite know what to expect. So you actually have to be quite receptive to what's being asked of you and the data that you're being given in the TEQSA portal. I think it's fair to say that most experts will always do their best. I mean, that's why you're an expert, that's why you're on the register, that's why you get commissioned to undertake these investigations. But I've always felt that it is better to ask a question early if you're not sure than to proceed for hours and days going down rabbit holes that don't lead you to answering what is actually requested by Tristan's group. So you will have a case manager, and they will be a really, really crucial part of the team that will provide you with advice. They won't give you the answers, but they will provide you with advice to at least corral you around the areas that are important. Next slide, please. Now, if I just wind back a section, I think it's important when you accept these tasks to understand what it is that you're being expected to do, and whether it's a course assessment or it's a re-registration assessment for an organisation. It's really important, you know, to understand what it is that you're being asked to do. And of course, there is always the deadline. And not to be rude, but the deadline is always in a short cycle usually. You know, you might have a couple of weeks sometimes to undertake these investigations. They're often not things that you get months to do, which is quite different from a recent assignment I did with PNG, which, you know, gave me 2 months to do, you know, three programs. So it does change, but you do need to get your Gantt chart out and work out when you're going to get the stuff and when you've got to have that done by, because you really are one of the linchpins in getting this assessment undertaken, because Tristan's group then has quite a bit of work to do in following up, in unpacking the assessments and preparing them for their next stage in the process. The other thing that I think is worth considering as an expert is, who are you really working for? Sure, you're commissioned by TEQSA to undertake these assessments, but who is really the beneficiary of your expertise? Now, within TEQSA, clearly the assessment group are seeking your advice on how you would interpret the data using your experience and applying that risk factor. They will, of course, then use these particular assessments to take to the various delegated authority or the commissioners themselves to actually pass judgment. And there's a lot of work to be done, so clearly they are relying on us to do our job very well. But I guess we really have to think about the consequences of making a bad judgment. Who will be directly responsible? And it is largely the students who, in many situations, are full-fee paying students who come to Australia to undertake what is regarded as one of the best higher education systems in the world. We have to just remind ourselves that we are protecting the integrity of the entire system, not just our particular discipline or the institution that we work for or TEQSA. It is the entire higher education system that is really depending on our expert advice to assist them in making judgment of whether a course or a provider is able to meet the standards. I've worked in high schools, in TAFE, and for nearly 30 odd years in higher education. I've worked in Singapore under the CPE, which is the regulator over there. So I've got a fair bit of experience in understanding the requirements that a higher education system has. But ultimately, it's the student who wears the fault if we don't get this right. And, as you'll be fully aware, there are many, many students who are engaged in higher education in the Australian sector. So there's a lot at stake. So when you get your assignment details, I find it's really important to apply that filter of what you're expected to do, what the consequences of your role will be in the whole area, and then I tend to unpack the assignment details. Now, they are listed in your contract, and you will go through those. And in the first couple that I did, what I did is I rewrote them in my own words, and I rang up my case manager and verified that. Maybe I'm just very cautious, but I found that actually gave me rapport with TEQSA at that particular point in time. And I think that building a relationship with your case manager, not being dependent on them, but just seeking clarification if you're unsure, make sure that you keep on track. Next slide, please. So you will get a full document that indicates the specifics that you need to go through, and they are in this level of detail for those of you who perhaps haven't experienced this. So you will have to go through probably 100, 150 particular line items that need to be verified. Many of these can be done quite quickly, and there are systematic ways of doing that. Next slide, please. Now, when you are commissioned to undertake an assessment, you get that contract with what's expected, and then you get the data in the wonderful, renowned TEQSA portal. Now, I can see some of my colleagues smiling because this portal sometimes can give us a little bit of grief, but after you've dealt with it a few times, you can actually work your way around it. Now, the domains that Tristan listed before, the 11 domains, are usually listed in the portal, and you can see those running down the particular brief. If we can just click that button, it'll just bring up a little slide that shows you what happens when you open up one of those particular domains. Within that domain, you will actually get a little portfolio of evidence and data. Now, it might be notes from the academic board, it may be industry advisory reports, it may be a review of an expert that's been commissioned by that private provider. This is gold for us because it's the data that we can actually use then to make our analysis on every one of those points. Next slide, please. In our package, we're also given a summary sheet. And that summary sheet, as you can see here, indicates the domains and the details that we need to go through and identify. And there is a quick sort of ready reckoner where you can determine whether something is met clearly because the evidence is there, and from your experience, that evidence would indicate that that person is of low risk and meeting the standard. You then get the opportunity to say what the rating of that is, whether it's a more substantive risk or whether they have not met the standard as specified. So I tend to have that to one side and I fill that in as I go along. Depending on the particular piece of information that you require, you may need to really dig deeply and read between the lines. Sometimes the way that the portfolio is arranged by the organisation may not align with the way you would get it if you were on academic board or you were on a board of studies or something along those lines. So sometimes you've got to untangle the information and you have to make a judgment of whether there's enough there. If there's not enough material there to make a judgment and you believe that there is something missing, you can contact your case manager and request additional information, and this can actually aid you in making a decision. If there is something clearly awry, then mark it as at substantial risk or that it's not met. You've got the rules and the regulations in the higher education standards framework. You can apply that when required, but it does really come down to you making that decision. So bear that in mind. Next slide, please. Now, once you've gone through all of this material, you do need to write a report because this is the connecting piece between your evaluation and the assessment team and the data that will be used by the commissioners. Make sure that the data that you're using is the relevant data. Go into the domain that's listed and find it there. As you've read the volumes of material, you may find that some of this information is sometimes listed somewhere else, and you'll need to draw on that experience of having an overview of the entire portfolio as you make that judgment. Sometimes I find that I need to go to the institution's URL to get verification. Sometimes it's better laid out there, as if I was a student wanting to enrol in a program. Often some of those details are provided. But generally, if the information's not in the portal, contact your case manager. Don't go and investigate by yourself. The portfolio is the portfolio to be evaluated. As I said, you use the principle-based system. Guidance notes are very useful that TEQSA has, and if you're familiar with those, you'll find they are gold in terms of your evaluation. You have to purely report whether or not the standard is met and why, so that Tristan's group or a commissioner, if they're making a decision about whether to approve or not approve, can draw on that evidence. So summarise it, put it in layman's speak, because often your discipline may have jargon involved so that people can understand exactly what it is. I think clear and concise is always appropriate. There's an example that I have here where obviously a question is asked. You respond directly to that particular question, but at the end of it, you have to be very clear in whether the standard is met or it's not met. It's no good saying, yes, the standard is met. That would be of no use to Tristan's group at all. You need to say why the standard is met. Cite the example, use a code that's listed on the particular portal. The other thing is it has to be defendable, because occasionally some of these decisions are appealed, and you need to be able to go back to what the expert said to actually make that defence. Next slide, please. So, in conclusion, TEQSA is relying on us and ultimately those students who are going to be the recipients of these programs or working in those institutions will be depending on us to provide very good advice. Case managers are really useful. I have to reiterate that they really do make enormous sense to consult them when necessary. It's never possible to be perfect, but at the end of it, when you submit the submit button and load that up, you want to be pretty confident that you have made a fair assessment. The other thing that I think is important is that we should also give feedback to our case managers about how the assignment has gone. so that they can learn from our experiences on the way the portfolios are put together, on the data that's presented, on the way that things link, and that will really help us. And I think it's also good, you know, when we do have TEQSA conferences and opportunities to sit and talk. You know, this would be very, very useful to sort of share, not specifics of your assignments, but in the approaches that you have to undertaking these assignments. So that's about all from me. So I'll hand back to Tristan, I believe, and happy to take questions later.
Thanks, Stephen. I'll be quite brief with this. This is about the outcomes of the assessment. Some of this I've already covered and Stephen's already covered. This is what happens after TEQSA has made a decision and how your reports are used in those outcomes. Next slide, please, Tom. So the three key areas that I'll cover is the process that we follow for adverse decisions. And when we say adverse decisions, that we refer to those decisions where TEQSA is going to impose a condition on a provider's registration or course accreditation, or we have decided not to register the provider for a full 7 years or accredit the course for a full 7 years, or we have decided to reject the application completely. We'll look at the internal and external review processes, and I'll talk very briefly about the AAT. The next slide, please, Tom. So in terms of adverse findings, I think that the key point to remember with adverse findings is that a provider needs to be afforded procedural fairness. That is, if TEQSA's identified concerns, and those concerns may be informed by your findings and analysis in your expert report, then we need to put those concerns, including the expert report or reports, to the provider for a response. So they can comment on the facts and the accuracy and the completeness of our findings. And then we need to take that into consideration when making a final decision. So before TEQSA makes a final adverse decision, before we impose a condition or before we impose a shortened accreditation or registration period, or before we reject the application entirely, we'll put that to the provider, we'll put the concerns that we've identified, and we'll provide them with a copy of your report. As I said earlier, we will, if needed, come back to you as an expert to assess parts of a provider's response. We're not discipline experts in the courses team. We don't have the capacity to do that, but there are a significant range of discipline experts in the higher education sector that we draw upon to be able to assess whether a provider's courses do meet the relevant standards. If it's a registration matter, we may call upon a governance expert or an academic integrity expert, or whatever area is of relevance to that adverse finding, to that adverse decision. So we get the provider's response. We'll send out another expert report, expert brief with expert report to you, and you'll repeat the same process. You'll assess the evidence against the relevant standards. As Stephen said, if something's not clear or if further information is needed, contact your case manager and we can request further information from a provider. We can request further clarification. Once we have your expert report and we have done our own analysis, we'll put a final decision or recommendation to the decision maker. It might be the commission or it might be a delegated decision maker. It could be a positive outcome that accredit the course for 7 years without conditions, or it could be we reconfirm our initial proposed decision, or it could be that we modify it based on the provider's response. And after that, the provider does have further rights of review, and that's what I'm going to just very briefly talk about now. Next slide, please, Tom. So some of our decisions are subject to internal review. So decisions usually made by a delegate, so a director in most cases in TEQSA. And these are course accreditations or renewal of accreditation decisions. They will go through an internal review process, and that internal review is normally conducted by the Commission or a Commissioner. Normally the Commission will conduct an internal review. And again, it's the same sort of process that we discussed earlier. A provider can submit further evidence. They can comment on the accuracy, the completeness, and any other matters that they feel are relevant for the internal reviewer to consider. Next slide, please, Tom. External review is also available to a provider. Typically, this is after the internal review has been completed for course accreditation and re-accreditation applications. For registrations or re-registrations, there is no internal review. It's the external review is the only option that's available to a provider. A provider can go to the federal court, which is very unusual. A provider would normally seek external review through the AAT or the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. That is an administrative review body, and they're largely concerned. They conduct what's called a merits review. So it's a similar process. A provider will submit further evidence in relation to the course accreditation or re-accreditation or the registration decision that they're disputing. They may bring in their own experts. We would then get a copy of that evidence, and then we most likely would come back to you as experts to review that evidence, to provide us with an expert report that we can then put to the AAT and make our case in the AAT. Next slide, please, Tom. So in terms of most external reviews of TEQSA's decision go through the AAT. We don't have very many AAT reviews. There aren't many matters referred to the AAT in terms of our decisions, but we do have some. There's nothing really for you to worry about as an expert. It's a similar process. We need, in engaging you, we are seeking you to provide an expert opinion on the evidence that the provider has submitted as part of their application to the AAT. The AAT is a little bit different in terms of how it makes a decision. The AAT needs to determine what's called the correct or preferable decision based on the evidence that they have before them. And this may be evidence that has not previously been provided to TEQSA. And again, I said the process is the same. We would come back to you with a brief and expert report and the evidence, and we would seek your expert opinion on that evidence. Next slide, please, Tom. And that's it for me and Stephen. I think it's now time to hand over to Justine for questions.
Hello, thanks for that, Tristan and Stephen. I am acutely aware that we have run over time, so humblest apologies. We might ask a few of the audience's questions just to make sure that we do answer a couple in this session. However, we might need to take a few of our questions that have come through on notice. So the first question I'm going to ask is probably going to go to Tristan. So Tristan, we've got two regarding experts. The first one is, how many experts generally work on an assignment or assessment, pardon me? And the second is the identity of an expert revealed to a provider? And perhaps we might want to talk about processes involved in supplying those expert reports to providers. Thank you.
No problem. Thanks, Justine. And they're both very good questions. Typically, it is 1 to 2 experts are used in an assessment. Most assessments are done with one expert, and most experts are involved in course accreditation or re-accreditation assessments. Where we do use experts in renewal of registrations, it's typically around governance, and again, a single expert is used. In terms of the identity of experts, what we do is we identify a pool of experts that we are considering to use during the assessment planning process. So we would identify that pool of experts. We then need to send a conflict of interest form to the provider. So that would include the list of experts, their name, their position, and their employer. And the provider can declare if they believe there are any conflicts with those experts. So the provider is aware of the experts at that stage. They're not aware of which of those experts we will finally select to conduct our assessment. If we do identify any concerns, then we need to put the expert report to the provider, and that would include the identity of the expert.
Righto, thanks for that, Tristan. I'm very sorry to all of the questions we have not been able to get to in today's session. We are going to take them on notice and respond when we do put the recording of this webinar up on our website. I'd like to pass on my many thanks to Stephen and to Tristan for their presentations today. I hope they've been of use to provide some insight into the role of external experts at TEQSA. We will be sending a post-event survey out to our audience members. We would really welcome your feedback on the session, as well as your ideas and suggestions for any future webinars. In the meantime, if you have any queries regarding the event, please email the events team at events@teqsa.gov.au. On that note, I'll say thank you all once again, especially to our audience members, and we hope that you've enjoyed the session. Thank you.